Fake HOA points gun at 78-year-old veteran over a garden hose. But FBI shows up. In every neighborhood, where people are supposed to live a peaceful life, sometimes there are untold stories hidden beneath the surface. Today, we explore a story not just about oppression and fraud, but also about the resilience of a community that stood up to protect its rights. This story is not just about an ordinary neighborhood, but also a wake-up call about the dangers posed by those who abuse power, those who self-proclaim themselves as community protectors, while in reality, they are deceiving and manipulating others. From absurd HOA regulations, self-appointed power-hungry frauds, to a community rising up to reclaim freedom and justice. This is the story of an elderly man, a Vietnam War veteran, and his grandson, who not only fought against a fake HOA, but also battled to protect the rights of all the residents in their neighborhood. Follow this story to the end, and I believe you will realize that when a community is united, no matter how strong the oppression, it cannot win. Can a fake HOA survive when faced with the resilience and unity of a community? Join me and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of this story? Do you think what we witnessed could happen in your community? Let's share and discuss the valuable lessons this story offers. Make sure to watch this thrilling story to the end, and don't forget to leave your thoughts, because I'm not a professional writer, but if I were to tell this story as a journalist, I don't think I could do better. This is the story of my grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran, who has always lived a humble but proud life. At 78 years old, he has faced many hardships, from the brutal battlefields to the quiet, solitary days in a small house with a beautiful garden he has devoted his life to caring for. He is a modest man, someone who never paid much attention to anything outside his little world, until one day a woman self-proclaimed as the president of the Homeowners Association appeared. Her name was Karen, and one thing I must emphasize, she had no power whatsoever. But that was the big problem. Regardless of permits or any approval, Karen decided that she was in charge of the neighborhood. Despite having no legal backing, she began making strange rules and demanding that everyone follow them. And that's when everything started to change. But it wasn't just Karen. There was another person behind these strange regulations. That was Greg, her boyfriend, someone I didn't know how to call other than a self-appointed cop. He had no credentials or power, just a fake tactical vest he must have bought somewhere, and wandered around the neighborhood acting like he had authority, giving orders to everyone. I still remember the first time I met Greg. I was gardening, trimming the bushes in the yard when he appeared, wearing a worn-out vest and oversized sunglasses, heading straight toward me like I was a criminal on the run. "Do you have a permit for that tool?" he asked seriously, as if my pruning shears were a dangerous weapon. "Do you have a permit?" he repeated, staring at me. I blinked, then burst into laughter. "You mean the pruning shears?" I asked, trying to suppress the laugh in my voice. "Yes. Hand tools like these can be dangerous if not properly maintained. HOA regulations require an annual inspection," he said, looking at me as if I had just uncovered a great secret. I could only stand there and laugh. But my grandfather didn't laugh. He just stood by the window and said something I will always remember. People like him won't stay funny forever. And he was right. At first, my grandfather and our family remained calm. Even though Karen and Greg's absurd rules were making things weird in the neighborhood, we didn't think these actions could turn into a real nightmare. We thought, as with previous incidents, they would just annoy us temporarily, and then everything would return to normal. But their presence began to form an invisible wall of fear, and we didn't know when it would break down. Things started to get serious when Karen, with her controlling personality, decided to use our private well to water her garden without asking for permission. No warning, no consent, and not a shred of respect for anyone else's property. She simply believed her rights were limitless and that everyone around her had to comply. That well was not just something my grandfather casually dug up. It was a project he had invested time and money into many years ago, so he could provide water to his beloved garden without relying on the public water system. It was a part of his humble but proud life, a labor of love he devoted to it over the years. And now, Karen, with her arrogance, had exploited and infringed on it without thinking about the consequences. This incident, although simple from the outside, was a huge shock to my grandfather. He had fought on brutal battlefields and witnessed things few could ever imagine, but acts like these, irrational actions that trample on personal rights, hurt him more than any war ever did. The feeling of having one's property and freedom infringed upon, the feeling of being dictated by someone who had no real power but thought they could control others, was truly an unforgivable insult. He didn't say anything when he discovered the issue, but I could tell he was deeply upset. In the following days, he quietly walked around his garden, sometimes stopping to look at the well, as if he could see through the earth to see what had been taken. He was not an angry man, but I could feel the frustration rising in him. From the moment I realized that Karen had invaded our well without permission, I knew something had to change. I couldn't let my grandfather continue to live under this senseless harassment, and I certainly couldn't stand to watch the despicable actions of Karen and Greg being imposed on us and other residents in the neighborhood. But simply protesting or speaking out wouldn't solve anything. People like Karen, with their arrogance and self-importance, would just laugh off our protests. It became clear. We needed a plan, but not just any ordinary plan. If we continued this way, we would only be like fish thrown on the shore, waiting to be trampled by those who believed they had power. I realized that to fight back against someone like Karen, I couldn't just stand still and protest. I had to act, and it had to be smart and subtle enough to prevent them from coming back. It had to be a creative plan, a strategy that would make sure they could never come back. After recording every absurd regulation and fake HOA signs Karen had posted around the neighborhood, I focused on the biggest issue, the well Karen had hijacked. This was not just a matter of property. It was an insult to my grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran, who had sacrificed so much to protect the country. That well wasn't just a source of clean water. It was a part of his life, a symbol of self-sufficiency and dedication to his family. What would I do with it? I decided I had to return the well to Karen, but in a way she would never expect. My goal was to create a subtle but satisfying form of revenge. I couldn't just tell Karen to stop. I had to make her feel the consequences immediately and unexpectedly. Instead of letting her keep watering her garden with our well water, I used the old plumbing in our house and modified it. My idea was simple. I would make the water Karen used for watering her plants become wastewater, gray water from the laundry system, and even the toilet. She would never realize it, because her pipes would look perfectly fine and she had no reason to suspect anything. All she needed to do was water her garden, and I would turn each watering session into an unexpected test. I didn't act hastily but planned everything carefully. First, I checked the plumbing system that Karen had used. I knew the plumbing in the neighborhood wasn't installed properly, with some joints loose. It took me several days to check and set up a secondary pipe that would lead directly to her system. All the water from our house would be diverted through this new pipe and go straight to Karen's garden without her ever realizing. Initially, I only planned to send gray water from the laundry system and the toilets into her garden. But then, I decided to take the plan a step further. I would create a perfect stream of water, a stream that wasn't just ordinary dirty water, but wastewater from multiple sources, like the toilet and dishwashing. By the time I finished rigging the plumbing system, I started to feel pleased with myself. Now it was just a matter of waiting. What was coming would come. I didn't need to do anything else. Just wait for Karen and her garden to become living proof of her stupidity and greed. Soon after, I started noticing strange changes in Karen's garden. The flowers she cared for every day began to wither, their leaves turning yellow, and the beautiful blooms suddenly became rough and shriveled. The plants in her garden seemed to lose all their life. She didn't realize what was happening. Why was the water she used making her plants slowly die? She grew even more confused when the vegetables in her garden were also affected. Clearly, it wasn't the plants that were the problem. It was her irrigation system that had become an issue. One day, I saw Karen in the garden with a hoe, standing frozen as she looked at her garden full of withered plants. She was grumbling and started calling Greg, her boyfriend, to figure out what to do. But I couldn't help but laugh at her helplessness. She always thought she had unlimited power, and now I had made her realize that, while she could control people, she couldn't control her own garden. Everything seemed to hit a dead end when Greg, in a tense confrontation with my grandfather, drew a gun and demanded that he kneel. It all started on a regular afternoon when my grandfather was tending to his garden, as he did every day. The flowers and plants were his world, his peaceful escape after so many years. But this time, something was different. as he carefully used his hose to water the plants. The sounds of tranquility weren't to Greg's liking. Greg, always looking for ways to assert his power, had been watching from afar. Not just about the watering, but because my grandfather had once again violated one of Karen's absurd rules that Greg thought was right. This time, the reason was the noise from the hose is disturbing the community's security, a reason that, had I not witnessed it myself, I would never have believed. Greg approached my grandfather with an angry look on his face, offering no greeting or explanation. "That hose needs to stop," he said, his voice full of command. "The noise issue. This neighborhood doesn't need more noise." My grandfather, who had faced countless hardships in war, rarely got angry. But this time, he simply stood there, staring at Greg with no fear in his eyes. My grandfather replied, "I'm watering my plants, not doing anything wrong. If you have a problem, take it to court." Greg didn't like my grandfather's calm response. He became more and more agitated. "You don't understand," he yelled. "You think you can do whatever you want without following HOA regulations." When my grandfather refused to stop, Greg became even angrier. He pulled a gun from under his jacket, pointed it straight at my grandfather, and ordered, "Get down. Kneel down now and stop." He no longer respected anyone. His gun was the only tool he thought would help him control the situation. My grandfather, with the calm resolve of a soldier who had been through war, looked Greg straight in the eye. A long silence filled the space, and from where I stood not far away, I could hardly believe my eyes. This man, who had survived countless life-or-death battles, was now facing a person who had no reason to have any power at all. At that moment, I felt a rising fear in my chest. I understood that if I didn't act immediately, my grandfather could be harmed, and everything would go too far. I knew I couldn't just stand by any longer. And immediately, I pulled out my phone and quickly sent a text to my uncle, an FBI agent, with 3 simple words that carried enough weight to change everything. "Gone. Grandpa." As soon as I hit send, a strange calm began to wash over me. My uncle, an FBI counterterrorism agent, would be the one to bring justice to my family today. In that moment, I could only hope that his intervention would help resolve this tense situation. Only a few minutes after I sent the message, I saw 2 black SUVs speeding toward our neighborhood. The doors of the vehicles swung open, and FBI agents stepped out, rifles in hand, their faces serious and determined. I couldn't quite explain the feeling when I saw them entering our neighborhood, but one thing was clear. I could feel a shift in the air. Greg, who was still pointing a gun at my grandfather, froze. His face turned pale, and his hands trembled as he realized that the power he thought he had was now gone. My uncle stepped out of the first vehicle, immediately approaching Greg and commanding him to drop the gun. There was no shouting, no fanfare. My uncle handled the situation with calmness and the power of the law. Greg lowered his gun, not out of remorse, but because he had no other choice. The other FBI agents quickly escorted him away, and I could see Karen, confused, watching from inside the house, witnessing the entire scene. Gone was the arrogance. Now there was only fear as everything began to unravel. My uncle walked up to my grandfather to check on him. My grandfather simply nodded, his expression calm, with no trace of fear or concern. I knew he had endured enough, and now he just wanted one thing: real peace. But that wasn't the end. As the FBI began their thorough investigation, things became even clearer. Karen and Greg weren't just troublemakers. They were involved in a much larger scam. Investigators quickly discovered that Karen had been collecting HOA fees from residents in the neighborhood, especially the elderly, who didn't have the means to defend their rights. Not only were the documents she used falsified with the stamp of a non-existent HOA, but Karen had also issued fake receipts, demanding residents pay fees for services they never requested. The residents, mostly elderly, had been coerced into paying fees that had no legal backing. Karen and Greg even created an electronic system to collect money from the residents, making it look like a legitimate operation, though it was completely fraudulent. By this point, it was clear that the issue wasn't just about collecting illegal fees. It was about a psychological manipulation system designed to make elderly residents fearful and force them to pay for services they never received. The FBI agents collected evidence and discovered that all of Karen's documents were forged, from receipts to contracts that appeared legitimate, all part of an organized scam. After all of Karen and Greg's fraudulent schemes were exposed, the community thought they could finally relax and return to normal. But in a dark twist, just a few weeks later, Craig appeared as though nothing had changed, with a more refined plan to take over the power Karen had left behind. This made everyone in the neighborhood worried that the cycle of fraud would continue. One day, while my grandfather was peacefully in his garden, a letter arrived at his house. It was a request from the Neighborhood Compliance Council Craig had just formed, demanding that my grandfather remove a decorative item from his garden, a small stone with the American flag on it. The reason Craig gave was that the stone didn't fit with the aesthetic standards of the HOA he self-appointed to supervise. This was the last straw. My grandfather, who had dedicated his life to the country, could hardly believe his eyes when he read this request. The stone wasn't just a decoration. It was a symbol of his patriotism and respect for the country he fought for all his life. Although he didn't speak, I could feel the anger and disappointment in his eyes. And I knew right away that this time, I couldn't let it go. Determined not to let my grandfather and I continue to suffer from Craig's ridiculous actions, I decided to use the technology one had at my disposal to investigate further. I started researching Craig, following community group discussions, and reviewing his actions. And then, I discovered an important detail. Craig hadn't just been asking for money from residents, but had secretly been collecting their personal information, creating detailed financial profiles of each family, and then using that information to threaten and coerce them into paying money to avoid penalties. In this way, Craig had continued building a fraudulent network, no different from Karen before him. He continued to collect money from residents under the name Neighborhood Compliance Council and exploited the fears of elderly people to force them to pay unreasonable fees. I immediately took photos of receipts, copies of payment request letters, and began creating a file to bring this to light. However, I couldn't do this alone. I needed help from the community. So, I decided to reach out to residents in the neighborhood, many of whom I had helped in the past. This time, not only my grandfather and I, but many others started to realize Craig's scam. People who had previously stayed silent now stood up and protested. The letters Craig had been sending no longer had the power to scare everyone. I began organizing a small meeting with a group of residents to discuss Craig's actions and how we could deal with him. We all agreed that we had to act immediately. Some residents, who had previously paid for the fake HOA, decided not to let Craig repeat the same mistakes. Together, we created a plan to bring this issue to light. Each resident would collect receipts, the unreasonable demands Craig had sent, and other documents we could use as evidence. People began openly resisting Craig's demands. One family began painting "No HOA Compliance" on their windows, while another family placed a large sign in front of their house saying, "We are not slaves to the fake HOA." Even those I thought had no opinions were now standing up for their rights. Some people even dared to post on social media, sharing their stories about being coerced into paying fees to a non-existent organization. In the end, after months of struggle, Craig could no longer avoid the truth. The FBI intervened, and once again, the investigation team quickly dealt with the situation, clearing up everything. The evidence that we in the community had collected was presented to the authorities, and Craig, the self-proclaimed successor to Karen in controlling the neighborhood, was arrested. His continuing fraudulent plans were exposed, and in the end, he had to face serious charges of financial fraud, coercing residents into paying for a fake HOA he had created. Once Craig was arrested, our neighborhood community breathed a sigh of relief. The days of anxiety and fear were finally over. The neighborhood that had seemed forever controlled by fraudsters had returned to peace. No more threatening HOA letters, no more unreasonable aesthetic demands or illegal fees. A wave of tranquility spread across the neighborhood as everyone realized we had won. However, the most important lesson this story teaches us is that we, a community of ordinary people living peacefully, knew how to stand up and protect our rights. Not through violence or anger, but through unity and resilience. We didn't let absurd rules or self-proclaimed fraudsters control our lives. In the end, justice triumphed. What's even more special is that not only did life in the neighborhood return to peace, but that spirit of unity made us stronger than ever. We realized that a truly strong community is not one where a single person makes all the decisions, but one where everyone stands together, supporting each other, fighting injustice, and not letting anyone abuse power unfairly. The gatherings over tea on Sunday afternoons, the conversations in the garden, have now become symbols of the freedom and peace we have regained. Families began organizing informal get-togethers, with no rules, no controlling councils, just the connection and love between neighbors. In those afternoons, everyone laughed and shared stories, exchanging joy and sorrow in the peaceful atmosphere we had fought so hard to achieve. A neighborhood that once seemed controlled and threatened by absurd rules and power manipulation has now become a free and livable community. And it was that unity that helped us understand that, as long as we stand together, no matter the fraudsters or oppression we face, we can still reclaim control of our own lives. So, the story of a community once threatened by absurd rules and power manipulation has come to an end, but the lesson it carries still resonates. It was the unity of the residents that helped them defeat fraudsters like Karen and Craig, regaining control of their lives. This isn't just a story about fighting oppression. It's also about resilience, intelligence, and the strength of a community when it stands up to protect itself. What about you? What do you think of such abuse of power in our communities? Have you ever witnessed a similar story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like these are not just lessons in justice, but also reminders that each of us can make a change in our own communities. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Hit the notification bell to get updates on exciting stories and valuable lessons we will bring to you. Let's share and learn from these small but meaningful things together. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.